This episode is presented by Dakota Resource Council. For nearly 50 years, DRC has worked across North Dakota to protect our land, water, and future.
Dakota Resource Council has definitely been shaping policy at the local, state, national levels. What role does DRC play in shaping that policy?
The industry is talking to people one at a time, and what DRC does is organize local groups and listen to people, and our voices are heard.
Become a member, volunteer, and take action, or donate today at drcinfo.org.
Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Welcome to Plain Talk. And boy, last night we had a not a State of the Union address, which I always think it's funny when there's a technicality like that. And it's like everybody's favorite thing to correct other people on social media. It wasn't a State of the Union address. Okay, whatever. It was the president's addressing a joint session of Congress. It may as well be the same thing, even though it's technically not called it. And apparently, I was reading Senator Kevin Cramer's press release about the speech last night, Chad, and apparently President Donald Trump's already solved everything in the 43 days between when he was inaugurated and last night's speech. Everything is fixed.
The stock market says something differently. I think the rising prices of consumer goods says something differently. I'll admit I couldn't take watching the speech. I couldn't watch frankly, some of the antics from the Democrats on the other side. So I watched spring training baseball last night.
I wish the Yankees had been playing. I will tell you, the antics from the Democrat last night. I wrote on Facebook that I was embarrassed for our country, and of course, immediately everybody thought I was talking about Trump, and I was. I was also talking about Democrats. That whole spectacle was beneath the dignity of this great nation. But
I feel bad for the Democrat leaders who are like, all right, guys, let's just play it cool. Your only job here is to listen to the speech and not become part of the story.
And Representative Al Green gets himself turfed from the chamber. Good job.
And likely his goal, right? I mean, who are the national pundits talking about this morning? So
yeah, just ridiculous. But according to Senator Cramer's statement, we've already secured the southern border. We've facilitated peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, which is the part I kind of wanted to put. This is a good transition into our guest, Dakota Rudisill, who is a professor from Ohio State University and has North Dakota ties. Used to work for Senator Kent Conrad, and is now speaking with us today. And we want to talk about the Ukraine-Russia situation. Which I did laugh when Senator Cramer said that Trump's been facilitating peace negotiations. I don't think any negotiations have happened yet. I mean, Ukraine hasn't really even been at the table yet. So I don't know what he facilitated. He kicked the president of Ukraine out of the White House. Dakota, first of all, thank you for coming on. And second of all, what did you think? I mean, I was, even setting aside how one might feel about America backing Ukraine, and there are logical arguments to be made about, America shouldn't be the world police, foreign entanglements. Those debates are about as old as our country is. And I understand them. And I don't necessarily agree with that position, particularly when it comes to Ukraine, but I understand it. But what happened in the White House to me even just seems something different, where we saw the president of the United States seemingly set up another world leader and put him in what it kind of looked like a struggle session. I was alarmed, and it was a remarkable moment.
Yeah, well, I would agree with it too, with what you just said. I mean, the way that I look at that is this is a performative politics moment. And that, and I don't know how much was actually planned and orchestrated, by, the White House versus what actually played out. But I think very clearly that they were going to have a performative politics moment. And, President Zelensky is very, very adept at media relations, right? I mean, from the very first night of the war, right? He was on social media.
I mean, he was in the entertainment industry before his political career.
Exactly, right? Like kind of like Ronald Reagan, right? Like he was an entertainer, right? Before he
kind of like Donald Trump, frankly.
Yeah. So he's very adept at that. But something that has been very impressive about President Zelensky is how hard he has worked to be straight and candid with the world and with his own people about what's going on. And one of the things that happened there is that the president and the vice president really wanted Zelensky to adopt some of their talking points and parrot those, or at least not contest them. And Zelensky wasn't willing to do that. And that is very much unlike the baseline now, which has emerged for people, in the Trump administration or people who want Trump's favor, which is you have to endorse false things that he says. And we've seen this play out during the confirmation hearings, where now the nominees for the top jobs at the Department of Defense scrupulously will not acknowledge the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. The closest we saw to that was the nominee for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He said, I understand from the president and vice president that words are very important. And so I will not say anything to undermine the negotiations. He couldn't acknowledge the largest invasion since World War II even occurred. And, we've seen the same things over the years with the whole stolen election lie that, if you want to, basically table stakes, if you want to be in Trump's good graces, you've got to sign up to false things that he said. And Zelensky, I think to his credit as a man of integrity, thinking about the hundreds of thousands of dead in his country fighting an authoritarian invasion, as a matter of integrity, he would not say that. And he said the truth about what Russia did. And I think that the people of Ukraine would expect nothing less from their president. And so I thought it was a very impressive performance by Zelensky. And I've been just so saddened and frustrated that people have said that he somehow did the wrong thing.
So, Dakota, what do you think about the president essentially, or maybe it's the vice president, who said, "You've never thanked us. You've never thanked us, so therefore, we don't owe you anything," or whatever. I mean, that's just silly.
Well, it's not only silly, it's false. You can, the tapes are there. Zelensky has addressed Congress. He has had so many meetings with American government officials of both, but on the Democratic side and the Republican side over the years. Just deep expressions of gratitude for how much the United States has helped Ukraine. He's said it 1,000 times. So that's just that is another false statement that he has not said thank you.
One of the things, Dakota, and I want to get into something, because one thing that sort of Trump supporters have been making a big deal out of is Zelensky's visit to Pennsylvania during campaign season. And I wanted to get your reaction to that. But before that, getting back to what happened in the White House, one thing that really worried me is I tend to think of, and maybe this is just because I'm an American and I have an American-centric view of this, but I feel like a lot of the infrastructure of international diplomacy flows through America. We are the brokers a lot of times in a lot of situations where we're trying to bring people together. And I'm completely acknowledging that we have been far from perfect in this role, but it has been our role. And in a lot of ways, we're about as much of an honest broker as you're going to get on the international stage. And I worry that when we bring a foreign leader in and set them up in the White House to just, and again, I looked at it as a setup. I mean, when you have Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend hurling questions about him, that looks like a setup to me. How much damage have we done to America's reputation as that broker? I mean, why would people trust us now?
It's an excellent question. And when you read the reactions of people around the world, it is just massive anxiety from our traditional allies in Europe, Australia, elsewhere. Basically what we understand to be the free world, which we've led since World War II, is in massive anguish and just despair and anxiety about this, because what we've seen from the Trump administration in the last 2 months is essentially abandonment of that, with the United States terminating Trump via executive action under the laws we understand it, illegally terminating U.S. aid and shutting down all sorts of those programs which help poor people and sick people around the world. And, Trump talking about, potentially, if necessary, using force against our NATO ally Denmark to seize Denmark, and we're going to absorb Canada, and just, all of these things. And, now with, the Trump administration voting with Russia, Belarus, and North Korea on a UN resolution on the Ukraine war, and now Trump has cut off military aid to Ukraine. It is a 180 and has done, I think, catastrophic damage to our position of global leadership.
Dakota, I'm old enough to remember that if a politician was at all seen to be in bed with Russia or with Vladimir Putin, it would be absolute political suicide. And now you're seeing things like on social media where people are saying, I saw some of the other day, somebody had a "I stand with Ukraine," picture, and somebody said, "You stand with Ukraine, you stand against the United States." How did we get to this point where it's somehow politically acceptable for us to be in bed with the Russians, with Vladimir Putin? Again, I'm old enough to remember when everybody knew that the Russians were the bad guys. How did we get here?
2 years ago, I should point out, to Chad's point, the South Dakota legislature passed the resolution unanimously standing with Ukraine. And from there, we're now here. I searched, actually. North Dakota didn't pass a resolution like that, but South Dakota did. Their politics aren't all that different from ours. To Chad's point, how do we get here?
Yeah, so I think it's massively regrettable, and I think it's just an amazing transformation. And let me tell you why. So the way that I think about this is that what Ukraine has done could not more powerfully resonate with the stories that we as Americans tell about ourselves, right? And fighting for liberty. So this is what happened, right? So an authoritarian state, right, invaded a country that's been working really, really hard to become a democracy. It's a post-Soviet state, right? And the tanks rolled in through the farmland, literally flying the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union. Many of the tanks and armored vehicles were flying it, and they were coming there to extinguish the democracy and independence of this people. And what happened? Everyday people in Ukraine grabbed their guns and they fought back. And the president of their country, on the night the war started, with the Russian missiles falling in Kyiv, with his ministers around him, his cabinet, said, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. The defense minister is here." And when foreign leaders were calling, including from the United States and Paris and elsewhere, and saying, like, Zelensky, we'll get you and your family and your children out of Ukraine, his response was, "I don't need a ride. I need ammo." He was staying. And and so it was the people of Ukraine with U.S. supplied weapons like Javelin missiles, everyday people joining the territorial defense forces with scissors that they were using instead of knives. You look at the pictures from that, just like scissors from the kitchen, right? And the Ukrainian army that we had supplied with weapons and training, they not only stopped the Russians, they threw them back. And now, in the last 3 years, it's been, it basically stabilized in 2022 into this war of attrition that Russia has been massively pouring men and material into and creeping forward. But that is amazing, right? You look at that, like, that resonates so powerfully with all these stories that we as Americans tell ourselves about what we would do if the Red Army rolled into our town. Like, we'd grab the guns and we'd fight back. That's exactly what they did, right? And so I think that,
beautiful movie. Henry Dean Stanton screaming, "Avenge me!" Yeah, that was a great movie. You're right. I mean, it's sort of this. I don't want to call it a fantasy, but it's fiction made real life. Like, you couldn't script this better.
Absolutely.
How's that story getting lost to Americans?
Yeah, and so I've been scratching my head about this, and I've had so many conversations with friends who are on the right, and colleagues who are in that world. Like, how did this happen, right? Like, why aren't there Ukrainians like going on tours of like local Republican clubs in the way that in the 1980s there were people who were aware of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were there talking about, like, here's what the Red Army is doing in Afghanistan, right? Like, why hasn't this been happening? Why aren't these the greatest heroes, especially like in like the American gun community and liberty loving community, right? And so what I think it is the answer is that so much. It's Donald Trump. It's this historical accident of this guy who was in this position in the White House, and then he had this call with Zelensky back in 2019 where, he was aware that Hunter Biden had gotten appointed to this, board of this energy company in Ukraine. And somebody had told him that, like, hey, there might be dirt on the Bidens. And so President Trump was on the phone with President Zelensky, basically shaking him down, saying, we're going to stop the flow of American arms appropriated by Congress to fight the Russians after their 2014 invasion, which seized Ukraine, which seized Crimea illegally. So Trump was holding up shipment of weapons that Congress on a bipartisan basis had sent to Ukraine and asking Zelensky to investigate his anticipated political rival and his son, like to get campaign dirt on these people. And of course, that blew up into, a scandal and an impeachment of Trump. And I think it just embittered Trump toward Ukraine and toward Zelensky. And, as we've seen with everything else, right? Like wherever Trump goes, just this massive apparatus, right, on the right around him swings everything in that direction, right? Like Republicans used to be free trade. Well, not anymore, right? Republicans used to be staunchly pro-NATO. Not anymore. And that, and I think that's how we ended up with the United States, under the Trump administration, like favoring like dictatorial Russia against the struggling democracy that wants to be us. It's stunning and it's tragic.
By the way, some of us Republicans still support those things, but we're apparently not allowed to call ourselves Republicans anymore.
I know a Republican.
Rob's a rhino.
I'm a rhino. So one thing that really sometimes the ideological incoherence of it, and I probably you've just explained it, where it's really just about Zelensky didn't want to get it. And by the way, I don't think any of us should be defending the Bidens. This isn't a defense of the Bidens, but President Zelensky, I think, wisely said, "I'm not going to entangle myself in your domestic politics." I think that was an integrity move from him. But you probably just explained it. It's all just about Trump's personality, and he's got a beef with Zelensky, so this is where it's all gone. But I'm thinking when you mentioned the USAID thing, A, it's a nice humanitarian thing to do. B, that's also called soft power, where we're using that money to further America's interests, where we can say, we'll come in and we'll help you. And it's a way of doing things. So all the time I hear the mega people talk about endless war and about we want to avoid wars. Well, I want to avoid war too. I don't like going to war either. And one way we avoid going to war is using soft power, using our wealth, our money to grease the skids a little bit. And I get sometimes it's a little grimy. Sometimes it doesn't work the way we want, but just hacking and slashing at that stuff. It's not just that we're losing America's influence as a military power. We're losing our influence as a soft power at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you look back at the history of statecraft, and countries, forever have used aid, right? Like, especially like humanitarian aid and other types of aid in conjunction with military power. Like the Romans were masters of this. Like if there was like a tribe near them, right, in Germania that, and I'm actually one of those people, like I like professionally think about the Roman Empire and write about it. But so if there's like some tribe, right, which is like, they've had crop failures, right? Like the Romans would come in and with their grain surplus would like help out that tribe. And then that tribe would help them with other tribes in Germania that were a problem, right? Like this has been going on forever. And I think especially in the context of 9/11, which everybody has forgotten about. But, one of the top conclusions on a bipartisan basis about 9/11 was what was distinctive about 9/11 was it was not an attack by a foreign country against the United States, right? These were 19 guys who reflected growing just virulent anti-American sentiment against just average people in the Middle East and the Muslim world, right, who just resented the fact that, the United States had had a number of conflicts in that region, right, and just kind of how our free and open societies did not line up with their really rigid views. And so this was just average people who basically got organized and radicalized, right, and killed thousands of Americans. And so the response of the United States government on a bipartisan basis with leadership from George W. Bush was to say, America fights for the right things. We are compassionate and we are going to help people. And so we saw strong support for the U.S. food program, which, by the way, primarily pays American farmers. And the President George W. Bush's initiative on HIV and AIDS, which by the best estimates, George W. Bush saved 25 million lives. He saved 25 million people in the developing world from dying from AIDS and HIV. And that, just like the moral power of that it just says like United States of America on that medication, that is massive, right, to preventing future 9/11s. And for some reason, now we're in this zone where we see, Secretary of Defense Hegseth and others just say like, he was asked about this. He said like, ideas don't matter. Like being nice doesn't matter. He said all it is lethality, right? Like, that is 180 degrees from the attitude that we all recognized after 9/11 that we needed to have.
So Dakota, what does the next 3.5+ years look like? I think to Rob's point, if you're a foreign country, why would you trust anything, right? I mean, the president can change his opinions on a whim. You've got a big chunk of Congress and the U.S. Senate who will move right. I mean, Lindsey Graham's a perfect example, right? I mean, he'll move right along with what Trump wants him to do. I mean, is it just sort of put your head down? I mean, I saw your physical reaction to that question, but is it just a matter of you put your head down for the next almost 4 years and just hope for the best and hope the whole world doesn't hate us at the end of this term, or what happens now?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, right? So my response as, a student and lover of the Constitution is to love the Constitution. And, we have yes, the president has a lot of power over foreign policy. But the founding fathers anticipated that power would be divided and all three branches of the government would check each other. The founding fathers were enormously concerned about tyranny developing at the federal level or the state level. They were enormously concerned about what James Madison in the Federalist Papers called faction. And by that, he meant a really zealous, motivated, passionate group, right? And he was very concerned about faction getting control of, a state or the federal government. And so what they did was they divided power, right? So you have three equal branches of government that can check and balance each other. And then you have another layer with the states, right? Power is reserved to the people. What does all this add up to? It means Congress needs to institutionally play its position as an equal branch of government to, the executive branch, right? And, the courts, if something's illegal, obviously they need to strike that down. Congress needs to have the back of the courts. The people need to use their voices. And, I keep reading all this stuff about there's a chill in Washington that, feels like, Russia when Putin came to power. A lot of coverage of that. A lot of, I think, blatantly intimidating things that people in the Trump administration are doing. Americans need to decide in advance they will not be intimidated, that they will exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, that they will commit themselves to nonviolent speech and holding views and not allow anybody to shove them around on if it's on foreign affairs or anything else. Like, use the system that Madison and Hamilton and Washington designed for us. And I think that holds the best prospect, right, of checking excesses by the Trump administration or whatever, right? Like, to me, it's always the right answer, right, to have fidelity to the Constitution and the rule of law.
Just before the show, we got news that the Supreme Court basically blocked Trump from blocking USAID cuts to USAID that were appropriated by Congress. So that's an example of what you're talking about, where the Supreme Court's come down and put the brakes on some of this. And also, like, for people who are upset about tariffs and stuff like that, Article 1 is a thing that exists in the U.S. Constitution. The problem is exercising Article 1 powers requires a functional Congress, and that's a topic maybe for a whole other segment. Dakota, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Great pleasure.
This episode is presented by Dakota Resource Council. For nearly 50 years, DRC has worked across North Dakota to protect our land, water, and future.
Dakota Resource Council has definitely been shaping policy at the local, state, national levels. What role does DRC play in shaping that policy?
It's important for my people because we are grassroots people. We've always been grassroots people, Indigenous people, and having the tools and the resources that Dakota Resource Council can provide would up your game so much that, you can win and you can face these decision makers head on.
Become a member, volunteer, and take action, or donate today at drcinfo.org.
Welcome back to the second half of Plain Talk, where our guests, and a lot of times I am working on the fly all the time from my phone. So when I'm booking guests or I'm emailing with people, gathering information, a lot of times I'm like in the grocery store and I'm texting, and our next guest is Dr. Paul Carson from North Dakota State University. But when I emailed him to book him on the show, I called him Dr. Paulson, like an idiot.
No problem.
So thankfully he was gracious enough and didn't immediately turn down.
You're being efficient, Rob, by just pushing the names together.
It was a little portmanteau. So we have a vaccine issue and right now, Texas is making a lot of headlines because they have a measles outbreak. We just had the first person die from measles in the United States for the first time in at least a decade. It was 2015, I think, if I'm remembering right. It's not great. And I started wondering, what are Texas's vaccine rates and compared to ours? And I was looking at some of Texas. Now remember, Texas is a huge state. They have 1.5 billion counties, apparently. And so wasn't looking at this at the county level. I was looking at just a statewide level, but Texas's statewide vaccine rates are better than North Dakota's. And that's one thing that I've been tracking for a while is the vaccine rates and the kindergarten vaccination rates, kind of what I look at, because I think kids who get vaccinated in kindergarten are more likely to carry through. I think it's if we're trying to measure vaccine sentiment, I think looking at kindergarten vaccine rates is probably a pretty good metric. The rates keep declining across the board for the quote unquote required vaccines. And I do scare quotes around required vaccines because they're not really required. If you don't want to take them, you just have to say, I object. I have conscientious objection. I have a religious objection. There are medical exemptions. Medical exemptions have actually gone down, but conscientious and religious exemptions have skyrocketed. They're up a lot to where we have closing in on 7% of people objecting. So I wanted to talk about some of that because I think the politics around it are strange. And it just seems really odd. Dr. Carson, first of all, one thing that I always like to point out, it's one thing to be skeptical of COVID vaccines. They were developed rapidly to what was for most of us a brand new type of illness. I can understand skepticism for that. I'm having a hard time understanding skepticism of the polio vaccine, which generations of Americans and North Dakotans have taken with no problems. The vaccines we're talking about, the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, the DTaP, hepatitis B, they've been around for a long time. Lots of people have gotten these. And yet we're seeing the worm turn, right? We're seeing people just decide, no, these are dangerous and I'm not going to do them. What's happened?
Yeah, those are great questions, Rob. And, I think you touched on it in an article you had recently in the paper. And vaccines, in a large measure, become victims of their own success. So these diseases that they prevent are largely gone from our collective consciousness. And people now, I think, fear the real or perceived risks of the vaccine much more than the diseases themselves. But what people don't really understand or appreciate is that these diseases are still circulating around the globe, and with our international travel, they are a plane ride away. and ready to be reintroduced into communities like we're seeing now in Texas very easily. And so this loss of that collective wisdom that we had about the dangers of these diseases is really, I think, contributing to their own success. And now also the online world stokes a lot of imagined fears about things, much misinformation. That term gets tossed around a lot, but this is space we work in our Center for Immunization Research and Education at NDSU a lot, and really it's troubling to see some of the bad information that's put out there that sort of fuels those fears.
Dr. Carson, this is a subject that frustrates me, so I can only imagine how much it frustrates somebody who's actually an expert in it. But when we're talking about 7% of kids not being immunized in kindergarten, what does that mean for two groups of people specifically? I think if a parent chooses to not have their kid immunized, I suppose that's the parent's choice, but it puts their kid at danger. But what does that mean for kids who can't be immunized because of health issues? And what does it mean for kids who are immunized? Are they put at more harm as well, just because these sort of diseases can come back in a bigger way?
Right. Those are great questions, Chad. So I think the way I like to explain this is vaccines really work in two ways, particularly the vaccines we're talking about here, measles, mumps, rubella, and some of the others. They work by protecting the individual. And so I can choose whether or not to get that vaccine. I can choose whether or not to receive that individual protection. But for the highly communicable diseases, like measles, the most infectious virus known to man on the earth, it's extremely contagious. They work a second way, and that is by what we call population-level immunity, sometimes colloquially referred to as herd immunity. And what that means is that if you get enough of the population immune, the pathogen can't get a toehold, it can't spread. And so you get a sort of barrier to epidemics or ongoing spread at the population level. And that's really important because many members of our society and our neighborhoods and our schools and our family and friends either can't get the vaccine because of their age. For example, in the measles vaccine, we don't start giving that until about the 1 year mark, 12 to 14 months. So, I have 3 grandsons under the age of 1. I really want them protected, and they rely on that population level immunity to protect them. We also have growing numbers of people who are immunosuppressed. We have many drugs now to treat a lot of different diseases that sort of tamp down our immune system for various reasons. Transplant patients, people with HIV, people on drugs to treat things like rheumatoid arthritis, etc. These drugs suppress the immune system, and even if you've been immunized, that immunity may not hold very well. And so those people rely on the rest of us to protect them. And so you can see what happens is when people start to consciously or unconsciously take advantage of the fact that there's population level immunity out there to make the decision, well, I'm not going to take any risks of the vaccine. I don't see measles spreading in my community. They can do that, and you can get away with that up to a point. And once you start chipping away at that population level immunity enough, then the pathogen can get a toehold and spread. And that's what we're seeing in Texas. And that's what frankly, we have, as Rob alluded to in his article, we have counties in North Dakota that are significantly worse than the areas of Texas that we're talking about. And it's often a matter of time before highly contagious viruses like measles get back into a community and circulate again.
Dr. Carson, you're on the faculty of public health at NDSU. And I've always perceived that as having, obviously, it's about the science. But when it comes to public health, there's a political vector to it as well. In that you have to persuade the public to believe this stuff. And it's really hard right now because there may be people who listen to a clip of this on the internet or listen to this podcast who are saying, well, yeah, he's a doctor and he's saying this stuff, but this super hot yoga instructor on Instagram is telling me I could stop measles with essential oils. And it just seems like that's where we're at right now, where we have Dr. Carson, who has a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science from St. John's University, a doctorate of medicine from the University of North Dakota. He had an internal medicine residency at the University of Nebraska, a fellowship in infectious diseases at the University of Minnesota. I happen to have your resume up on my screen.
He has it memorized, Dr. Carson. It's
I'm a fan. No, but you have all of these credentials, which in my mind were like, okay, actually listen to what this guy has to say, versus yoga instructor who has 2 million followers on Instagram. How do we, I mean, from your position, like, how do you win that war?
But you're alluding to something that's a great frustration for us. That there's a book that was recently reissued. It was put out in 2015 and reissued here again, I think just this last year, called The Death of Expertise. And it kind of gets to what you're talking about, that what have been traditional sources of expertise, people who are highly trained in that particular area that we're talking about, people who have done research in that area, published on that area, are respected by their peers, are now sometimes even marginalized. Like, well, they're beholding to big pharma, they're beholding to something else, and influencers seem to get just as much sway. I want to believe, and I still hope to believe, that most people look to higher quality sources of information and more authoritative voices. I would say that when you look at the banter that goes back and forth, even in sort of the wasteland of some of the areas of the social media, most people will try and put out an idea, even if it's a bad one, by citing some kind of science. And so it's better science that always sort of displaces bad information and bad science. So we are on a big push right now to actually improve our I've had a shift in my thinking on things that we have to start earlier, improve our science literacy. How do we kind of tell sort of low quality or almost garbage, claims that are empiric claims? The vaccine's more dangerous than the virus. I mean, that's an empiric claim that can be tested, right? How do we assess sort of those garbage claims and get sort of better, higher quality evidence data? And I think it starts earlier with, like, even in like middle school, high school, and college, to help people know how to look at empiric claims and assess those better. But it's very frustrating. I also think we need to learn how to use social media ourselves. So, people in medicine and in public health, that isn't their usual bailiwick. I mean, we're used to kind of saying, well, here's my education and my training, here's the information, and now you know what to do. And that just doesn't fly anymore. It doesn't fly.
So you're not just battling, though, the yoga instructor with 2 million followers. Now the Secretary of Health and Human Services has been known to be a vaccination skeptic. And I don't want to throw like a political bomb at you here, but do you think your job is going to get harder in the next 4 years? Because now you've got people who are not just saying, hey, it's the hot yoga instructor, it's the guy who agrees with me on the skepticism around vaccinations.
I sort of want to dance around the political landmines with this as well, because I don't see this as a political issue, and it's very frustrating to me that it's politicized. So it's sort of stunning to me that an empiric claim, is the vaccine more dangerous? Is the virus more dangerous? So what happens, when you get the virus? What happens when you get the vaccine? Something we can readily assess, test, have a lot of data on, gets pushed aside for kind of crazy claims. And interestingly, when I started at this in the public health arena, so I was in the clinical world for most of my career, moved to public health in 2013. The area where we were having conflict, having to try and change, was really kind of educated liberal elites on the coasts. It was I don't want to be disparaging anyway, but what we kind of called the crunchy granola moms. People who were very interested in health food, healthy lifestyles, healthy living, tended to politically be more aligned with the left, very concerned about what sort of went into their body, and that was the area where we had the most vaccine resistance. That has dramatically shifted, and that really shifted during the COVID pandemic. And I think the rapidity of the problems, the proclamations that came out from public health, and I think public health did a lot of great good, and I think they also did some things that we need to learn from that we could do better. But that sowed a lot of mistrust, especially on the right. And now the framework has shifted, and it's people who, are kind of talking about medical freedom, health freedom, my body, my choice, personal autonomy. And in fact, that's the messaging that a lot of the anti-vax, the sort of what I call professional anti-vax groups are messaging. They used to be trying to push autism and toxins and all that. And the science is just really strong on that. That didn't get as much traction as I think they wanted in the past. And now it's this sort of health freedom thing, and that's been embraced more by the right. And we have a pretty red state here, and that's been a real issue for us in North Dakota. I don't see this as a political issue, but it's become one. And when you look at the Gallup polling data, and so on, about concerns about vaccine safety, about whether they cause autism, whatever, it tends to now fall along partisan lines, unfortunately.
I don't view it as a political. I mean, I think the reality is it is a political issue. I find it bizarre where people are like, well, I'm a Republican, therefore I have to be against vaccines, or I'm a Democrat, I have to be for them. I don't think about that. I go to my doctor, and I remember during COVID, like I had COVID before the vaccines came out. When they came out, I had a conversation with my doctor. I said, I've already had COVID. Should I get the vaccine? She said, yes, absolutely. You should. I got vaccinated. I have no idea what my doctor's politics are. We don't talk about that when I'm in her office. We talk about usually how fat I am is the bulk of our conversations. Unfortunately,
Rob, we might share a doctor.
Yeah, you think so? Could be. Anyway, I don't understand that. I thought your point about learning from some of the things, because again, it's unavoidable that this is political. And I remember talking about some of the things public health during the pandemic, one thing that just stuck in my craw as somebody, again, who wanted people to get vaccinated, who believed in this stuff. But I'm watching a lot of public health people condemn the Sturgis motorcycle rally and then turn around and say, but these Black Lives Matter protests are okay.
Absolutely.
And like that is so blatantly political. Like, what are you doing? Why should I trust you when you're saying stuff like that?
Yeah. So I was working a lot with local public health, some even in our government entities, and I was very vocal about, like, we cannot play into partisan politics either side. And I thought that was a very good example of where some people in public health, not all, it was a fact that people in public health were speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Wrong, bad. I could give you a number of other examples where I think we did not do well. And that trust is going to be hard to regain. But you alluded to something a second ago that I think is an important point. And you said, I go to my doctor and I ask my doctor. When you also look at polling data on who do people trust? Is it my uncle at Thanksgiving? Is it TikTok? Is it Ellen DeGeneres or The View or whatever? Your personal doctor tops the list still as the person most people trust most. That trust has eroded somewhat as well during the pandemic, but it still tops the list. So when
it comes to people dispensing medical advice for you, guess who has access to your blood work? Guess who has access to how much you weigh and your health history and everything else? That person does.
And that person has been a partner with you, trying to look out for your health, presumably, over the course of your relationship with them, and has your best interests at heart. I point out that physicians, I don't want to get into the pandemic very much here, but I will point out the physicians, a big AMA poll, took the COVID vaccine before any mandates were issued anywhere. When that first rolled out at a rate of, I think it was something like 95%. So, physicians kind of had a sense of where they personally, had a stake in that. But to be fair, we were building the plane, as we were flying it. And one of the things that I think is very important for public health to do is to communicate very honestly and to be open when we don't know, like when we don't understand something fully, to kind of say, we don't know. This is a moving target and we're likely to learn more, and things are, the recommendations may change. I think sometimes, public health came out with proclamations that were too strong too early in the pandemic. That aside, we know a lot about measles. We know a lot about the measles vaccine. We know a lot about the disease. This has been around. Vaccine's been around since the 60s. This is a no-brainer. Measles is a dangerous virus. People don't appreciate that because it was so common, back in the day. But it is a very dangerous virus, and something that death was completely unavoidable. There are other serious complications that can come from measles, completely avoidable. And it's a tragedy what's happening in Texas. And we are very prone to it happening here in North Dakota. We have a number of counties where this could easily take off if somebody brings it in usually from overseas. Somebody travels, brings it in, and then it takes off.
So, Dr. Carson, that was going to be my question. It doesn't feel like we should be surprised if we see a news report that there's a measles case that pops up somewhere in North Dakota. One, I assume you're encouraging everybody to get vaccinated right now if they're not vaccinated. But secondly, if a measles case does pop up somewhere in North Dakota, what happens then? What is sort of the public health response to that, and what should people sort of be thinking about?
Right. So a single measles case is what we kind of consider a sentinel event because that case usually means there's been many others that have been exposed. You're contagious with the measles virus about 4 days before the rash and about 4 days after the onset of the rash. Interestingly, there's so few doctors that have actually seen measles in the United States now since the vaccine has been so successful that a lot of times they don't recognize what's going on in their community until a number of cases have started to pop up. But by the time you see a case, it's already out there and spreading. It's an airborne virus, so it can linger in rooms for hours after the person has left. What happens then is there's a pretty rapid mobilized public health response. So you do extensive contact tracing. You look at the circle of people that person may have exposed for people who may be vulnerable, unvaccinated. Vaccine campaigns get kind of launched around those cases. There's lots of efforts now to get the unvaccinated vaccinated in Gaines County, Texas, and New Mexico, where it's spreading. Those people are put into isolation. So isolation means you isolate the sick person so that you don't spread it further. You remember we had a lot of this during the COVID pandemic. And you may quarantine exposed vulnerable people. Thankfully, most of us are vaccinated, but we've got counties in North Dakota where 20, 25, 30% of the kindergartners, aren't vaccinated. If it kind of gets into one of those schools, you'll see it spread, and that often shuts down a school. It may shut down an entire school for weeks. These are very expensive outbreaks to try and contain. It often costs millions and millions of dollars to try and bring them under control. But it usually requires a massive public health effort, as we're seeing in Texas. And I will say, Robert F. Kennedy did commit CDC resources and epidemiology teams to go help with that outbreak. So that's the kind of thing you'll see when a single case pops up.
So what should we do to encourage more vaccination? Because I got to think at this time right now, anything that even has the whiff of mandate to it, is not going to get through our legislature. Certainly not going to get through Congress if we try to do it at the federal level. And the public, I think, would revolt. So this has to be a persuasion campaign, right? I mean, really, at the end of the day, and by the way, you're talking about, like, people talking about medical freedom. You have medical freedom. Like, you have the freedom to not get vaccinated in North Dakota if you want to. I don't think it's a wise choice.
Right.
You do have that freedom.
Yep.
But how do we, at some point, like how do we persuade people, to turn the tide on this?
Your show's a great start. I think we're happy to talk about this whenever. I've talked with my public health colleagues. Sadly, I said whenever an outbreak occurs, we need to be out talking about it, because that's actually what starts to turn the tide. People regain that fear of the pathogen that the vaccine is meant to prevent. It's real. It's in your face. I just heard a mom, on radio, I can't remember which show, who said, my child was unvaccinated, but I heard that a kid died in Texas. It was a school-age kid. I think by the reports I heard, was a healthy kid. That starts to hit home, make people realize, well, what is my decision I'm making? California, before the Disneyland outbreak, was one of the most liberal states for allowing exemptions to vaccine in schools. After the Disneyland measles outbreak, they flipped to being now one of the most restrictive states. They don't allow conscience objections there. I can't remember the number. It's about 20 states allow conscience objections to school mandate. And we've had mandatory vaccines, for schools for decades, but those have been eroded by, these personal belief and conscience objections. North Dakota is one of the easiest states to get those. It's, as you alluded to, parent just sort of checks a box on a form and gives it to the school secretary, and that's that. So you're right. It's a persuasion campaign. Now, I don't think it's going to change in the legislature at all. So having conversations like this, doctors being really well informed about these things and talking to their own patients. I mean, this happens at the medical encounter, right? So at your kid's 12-month visit, that's the first dose of measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. The doctors need to be promoting this, talking about this, educating their patients and the moms and dads. And people need to go to good sources of information, reliable sources of information. You have to ask yourself, I mean, we are all prone to what is called selection bias and motivated reasoning. We seek out the stuff that sort of affirms our gut instinct or affirms kind of what tribe we identify with. We have to, when it comes to sort of empiric claims like this, is the vaccine more dangerous or the virus more dangerous? We have to get past our little tribal echo chambers and seek out good information. And if you don't trust the CDC and you don't trust, your public health, well, then look at other countries. I mean, you're going to find the same thing in the UK and Denmark and Sweden and Israel and so on. It's all same information, same data. Go to good sources of information.
Talk to your doctor. Just talk to your
and
local
talk to your doctor. That's a great place to start.
And I'm sitting here thinking about if I'm a parent of a kindergartner, and I mean, we know a kid died in Texas. That doesn't, that could happen here. Or if your kid gets measles and then infects one of his, immunocompromised classmates and dies. I mean, you'd think parents would just want to avoid that situation at all costs. And so I have a very specific question. You said 20 to 25% in some counties of kindergartners not vaccinated. If we start to see measles in that county, I mean, what's the mortality rate of kids who get measles?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you asked that specifically, Chad, but I'm going to use it to expand a little bit on what is the threat of measles. So some people will point out rightfully that mortality from measles started to fall well before the vaccine was released. And that's because we had better nutrition in the United States. People got healthier, and vitamin A deficiency is a known risk factor. I mean, we don't have that really anymore, hardly at all in the United States. So if you have adequate levels of vitamin A, you tend to have a lowered mortality. The main thing that killed people was the secondary bacterial infection. So pneumonia was very common, and bacterial pneumonia would kill people. And antibiotics came about in the 1940s and got better and better in the 50s and 60s. So mortality was already low. But even in our modern health, good nutrition, access to antibiotics, it's still about 1 out of 1,000 will die, maybe a little higher than that. About 1 out of 1,000 will get encephalitis. This is inflammation of the brain that can leave you with permanent disability, brain damage. A similar rate of about 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 1,300 can develop a terrifying complication of measles called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. It's a big mouthful, SSPE. It's where the measles stays in a sort of slow, dormant state in the brain, and it causes progressive brain damage and severe disability and eventual death over a matter of years to a decade or so. It causes hospitalization in about 1 out of 5, about 20%. And then another thing that we've just learned in the last decade or so, this is a really interesting observation that researchers found that as measles rates fell, so did other infectious diseases in children that were vaccinated. So mortality from other infectious diseases started to decline after measles vaccination was widespread. And what we found since is that measles, in a sort of a lesser way, acts almost like the HIV virus. It attacks our immune cells, and it actually kind of wipes out much of our immune memory for about 2 to 3 years. So you're much more susceptible to other infectious diseases. And now we know that children who have had a measles infection are more prone to suffering and dying from other infectious diseases in the 2 to 3 to 4 years after their measles. So it is really something we want to avoid.
Yeah.
It's avoidable.
It sure sounds like it. And it is avoidable. And by the way, those of you out there, we talk about tribe and political pressure, and I got to do this. Let me let everybody in on a little secret. Nobody has to know you're vaccinated. You don't have to share that with anybody. That's between you and your doctor. You can get yourself vaccinated, you can get your kids vaccinated, and you can still show up at the local mega meeting and you don't have to tell anybody that you got vaccinated. Do it for yourself and do it for your kids. Dr. Carson, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks
Thank you, Dr. Carson.
Yeah, great to talk to you guys. Thank you.
Hey friends, we've got a new way for you to participate in the show.
You can now call us or text us with your questions, comments, or anything you want us to discuss on Plain Talk. Just give us a call or shoot us a text message at 701-587-3141. That's 701-587-3141. It's super easy. Leave your message, tell us your name and where you're from, and we might feature it on an upcoming episode.
Thanks for listening to Plain Talk. Now let's get back to today's episode.
Well, two great interviews today. I mean, it's nice just to talk to subject matter experts who we can just, walk through this stuff. And it's, Chad, it's sometimes, when I'm making fun of like the Instagram influencer or whatever, I am very aware of my career trajectory and how I got to where I am as somebody who didn't go to journalism school, and now has, arguably probably one of the, biggest political audiences in the state. And so I guess maybe some people might look at that and say, well, that's kind of hypocritical of you, but also notice I'm not making wild claims that I can't, and I'm not claiming to be a doctor. I talk to people like Dr. Carson, and I do think like you don't have to believe, we don't live in a technocracy for a lot of good reasons, and people can be wrong. Nobody is infallible, but I have a really hard time when the mountain of scientific evidence, the mountain of empirical evidence for something like the measles vaccine, which your parents are probably vaccinated, your grandparents are probably vaccinated. This has been around for a long time. Generations of North Dakotans, generations of Americans have gotten this vaccine. It has had real positive impacts on our society. How can you just throw all that overboard and just pretend like it doesn't exist?
Rob, we're both fathers, and I think you'd agree with me that you do anything to protect your kids, right?
I mean, cut the heart out of my chest.
Right. And so I just can't imagine being a parent who's like, I'm not going to have my kid get a shot for measles because I read something on the internet, and that may lead to my kid getting measles and therefore 20% chance of them being in the hospital, a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying, a 1 in 1,000 chance of being permanently disabled. I just can't imagine making those choices. And I know that like somehow we have to get to a point where we can have conversations to do that persuasion, right? It can't just be like, you're an idiot if you don't do this, or you don't care about your kids if you don't do this. But just going through my head and just thinking about if I made a choice that would do this to my kid, how would I live with myself?
I don't know. I mean, and part of it is I wrote in my recent column, and Dr. Carson referred to it as being sort of the victims of our own success. Like vaccines, we don't have, most Americans they never experienced polio, right? They have no idea. Most Americans don't really have any experience with measles. Dr. Carson was talking about most of our doctors have never seen a measles case. And the reason for that is because, for all practical matters, we eradicated it from our society by vaccinating people. But it speaks, in the first part too, we were talking about Ukraine, and it speaks to just a complete erosion in trust, in an unwillingness to believe the things that we know to be true, have known to be true for so long.
And I think Dakota did a really nice job of sort of laying out, like, the story of Ukraine is the story that we wish we could tell about ourselves. I mean, you talked about Red Dawn. I remember watching that show as a kid and thinking about and go playing with my friends outside, and we pretend that we were taking on the Red Army, right? We're protecting our house. That's what the Ukrainians did. And now we're against them? Now we're for Russia? Like, what is happening?
Well, for a place that, I mean, listen, if you lived, I mean, the people today who are uprising against the government and the government's terrible and all this stuff, if you were that way against Russia, you lived in Russia and you behaved that way, they would put you in jail.
Or kill you.
Or you'd suspiciously fall out of a window or something. Like, that's what
January 6th ain't happening at the Kremlin.
No, they would have mowed the crowd down. They would have shot them and killed them and covered it up.
Yep.
Because that's how the Putin regime operates. I mean, look at what happened to, I don't understand how Americans can't look at somebody like Navalny, who died in prison, who by the way, had left Russia, had fled Russia. And there's a great documentary about him on HBO. You should read his book as well. I don't know how Americans can't look at somebody like that and see a hero. But to many, you talk to somebody like Tucker Carlson, he's not. He's a disgusting human being.
It doesn't make any sense. And I thought, I think Dakota was a good person to talk about this. He's got some North Dakota roots, but he also is very knowledgeable, very passionate as well. I mean, I think that you could see that. But those two guests were great. I mean, exceptionally informative, both of them.
Yeah. All right. We got a couple of listener texts. First one, another repeat text, Nolan from Wing, North Dakota, who had texted us in before, and he'd objected to our objection to intelligent design being taught in school. So Nolan texts again, appreciate your guys' response to my question last week, which was, why do you oppose teaching intelligent design alongside evolution in schools? He goes, my biggest issue with evolution theory, at least the one I was taught 20 years ago, was that it did not acknowledge the large gaps in its thinking that intelligent design can explain. I was taught that evolution is 100% fact and not to be questioned, which is not true. Keep up the good work. Glad I found your podcast. Yeah, I can't speak to the way Nolan was taught, evolution. And again, I think both you and I, Chad, agree. I don't have a problem if during the science curriculum, teachers make allusion to the fact that we don't have scientific explanations for everything, not that are necessarily concrete. We have some theories. Sure. There's nothing wrong with talking about the way various religions fill in some of those gaps and acknowledge these are some of the belief systems that are out there. That's the real world. I don't have a problem talking about the real world. I have a problem with the legislature coming in and mandating religious doctrine, which is what the bill in the legislature did.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say even more fundamentally, I have a bit of an issue with the legislature getting too heavy-handed in terms of what local political school districts should be doing. I mean, I think that there's some different, like right now, there's a bill going through the legislature that says schools must teach the Holocaust. Well, of course. And how do you not teach the Holocaust? I don't think we need a bill that says that. But I appreciate Nolan listening. I appreciate that he listened to our response to his initial message and didn't respond with, they disagree with me. I'm done listening to them, because that feels like that's often the society we live in these days. So kudos to Nolan.
This back and forth we've had with Nolan is what we need more of. I'm glad he's listening to us, and I'm willing to listen to him as well. In fact, having read a couple of messages, I don't know that Nolan, and I don't know that we disagree with him all that much, really. Right. I think we want some common sense things. All right. The other one is Chris from Bismarck, who I don't normally wouldn't normally identify a last name, but Chris, in his text talks about how he used to work at the Capitol. This is Chris Jones, former head of the Department of Health under Governor Burgum. He writes, still listening to the podcast. I do enjoy it, and maybe I miss the camaraderie of when I worked at the Capitol. However, after listening to the episode from February 28th, the hypocrisy becomes too great. You continue to report on culture and resolutions and say they get too much time. I'd ask you to look at how much time your podcast spends on what you say is unimportant. Aside from property tax and a little on school lunches, there's been very little on appropriations. I believe citizens are interested in where the dollars are spent, reference property tax. I've heard very little about spending, entertained, but not informed. And, I guess how we get this is a quandary when you're covering this stuff, because on one hand, the cultural war ephemera, I think everybody listening to this podcast knows how I feel about it. You know how Chad feels about it. I think it's nonsense, and I do think we spend too much time on it. That being said, these are real bills, and a lot of them failed in the first half, but some of those votes were pretty narrow. And some of those bills, if they pass, are truly dangerous.
Rob, I disagree with the premise of what Chris is saying to us. I mean, I went through and looked at the guests and the conversations we've had since the beginning of the session. We had Sean Cleary talking about prisons. We had Lauser on to talk about same-sex marriage and property taxes. We had Bale talking about annual sessions. We had Meyer and Scott Davis talking about gaming and how that affected things. We had the live episode where we talked with the two legislative leaders quite a bit about appropriations, quite frankly, and how some of their decisions affects dollars. We talked about ESAs and education funding with Axman. We had Kelly and Drew on when Aaron was guest hosting. That was a lot about things that are fiscal in nature. We've had Weber and Lauser talking about taxes. We've talked about chronic wasting diseases. We've talked about Karen Carls about out-of-pocket expenses in human services. Austin Foss, Travis Fink about the appropriations for what's the word I'm looking for?
Public defenders.
Public defenders. So I sort of disagree with the premise of Chris's question. I also think, Chris has a different point of view on this than most listeners. I mean, he was the head of human services. He understands this appropriation stuff and sort of the insides much more. To suggest, I mean, maybe he is entertained but not informed. I would suggest the vast, vast majority of people listening are informed by many of the things we talk about because they're not living it every day the way Chris did. I also think Chris might miss being at the Capitol and being in the middle of the fight over human services appropriations. And maybe this is, you know what? We should have Chris come on and talk about what he thinks they should do differently in the human services budget moving forward. You know, he had several years of being in this job to change. I'd like to hear what he thinks should be changed now.
By the way, if you want to leave us a voicemail or send us a text, number 701-587-3141, 701-587-3141. Add it to your phone. Shoot us a text while you're listening. If you've got a reaction, we'd be happy to read it on air. I just wanted to, you're absolutely right. We've covered a lot of topic areas. It does sometimes even feel to me that we talk a lot about the culture war stuff. And that was my defense. I mean, that is something I struggle with when I see a bill or I see a floor debate or something, and I have to have, should I invest time in covering it? Should I get the video? Should I write something about it? Should I book a guest for the podcast? How should I handle this? And it's tough to know what the right balance is between giving nonsense more attention than it deserves, but also alerting the public to some very stupid legislation that is winding its way through the halls of power in Bismarck. So,
right.
I don't know that we're going to get that balance right for everybody. I will say I'm aware of it. I know Chad's aware of it. We're doing our best, but
the book ban is not nonsense.
Right.
It's passed last session. It's passed a chamber already, right? The trans bathroom issue is not nonsense. Something passed last session. It's passed one chamber already, which, by the way, I heard that the price tag statewide to fix the hand washing thing, $150 million if every school district had to change that. So those are connected to financial issues. I understand where he's coming from. I get frustrated where, an individual bill that appropriates $3 million, they'll beat it up because it's too expensive. Then you have an agency budget where they throw in these different $3 million appropriations, and they don't necessarily dive deep into those things if they're in the agency budget.
Wouldn't it be a hell of a thing if we axed school lunches because it's too expensive, but then we cost ourselves $150 million because we don't want boys and girls washing their hands together in bathrooms that have existed that way since the 1960s?
I trust that the legislature is going to figure this one out because they ain't going to spend $150 million on that.
Well, yeah.
One other thing I just we did a smaller version of Chris's message. And one of the things he talked about is the media should look into a few different things. I want to make it clear. I'm not part of the media. I'm a commentator. I come on this thing to comment on what's going on. So, if there's some expectation of muckraking happening on Plain Talk, it's not going to happen for me. Maybe Rob can do some muckraking.
Well, I am the media. And all I can tell you is I'm doing my best to select topics that I think are interesting and I think are informative to the public, while also understanding that my priorities aren't going to be everybody's, which is why there's a lot of us that work in the media. Maybe there's somebody else doing it, but it's hard. I mean, when you look at the amount of public interest that are in some of these bills. You look at the amount of testimony that gets submitted. You look at the number of people who show up and testify on these bills in committee. Public cares about these things, like it or not. And so we're kind of obliged to follow. I mean, I think sometimes people view the media as leading the charge and sort of directing what people are going to be focused on. That ain't true. A lot of times we're covering things because the public's interested in it. I mean, most of the time, we're following the herd. There is a time and a place to try to make the public care about something they're not seeing. I mean, that's important too. But I mean, some of the times when the public's disinterested, you don't really have a choice.
Yeah, I'm okay with people being entertained by the podcast because we actually need people to listen if we want to talk about some of these meatier subjects.
Yeah. I think we're doing a pretty good job. But I'm biased. I'll admit that.
I just to defend Chris, he said he's listening. He was giving us some constructive criticism on how we could be better.
And believe me, I take it to heart, and I hope he understands that it is something, the point he makes is something that I struggle with. I think about it all the time. I'm making the decisions I'm making. I guess I'm not striking the balance maybe quite the way he likes, but c'est la vie. Quick reaction to the not State of the Union last night.
I did not watch 1 second of it. I will tell you that I watched the Dodgers-Reds spring training game last night because my friend Roki Sasaki was making his debut. But I will tell you, from what I saw going into it, I knew Trump was going to be Trump, and Democrats were going to respond in a less than great way. I wish they would have just sat there and listened to the speech rather than getting kicked out of the chamber. But yeah, just more crap.
One of the funny things I wrote last night, frustrated that I was embarrassed for our country, just put that statement on Facebook. It got, a couple hundred comments last time I looked. A lot of people assuming I was talking about Donald Trump, and I was, no question about it. But, I was talking about Democrats too. Like the whole spectacle just made me sick to my stomach. And to be honest with you, the state of the, I understanding this wasn't technically a State of the Union address, but it was basically a State of the Union address. Politically, they don't matter that much. They're all stagecraft and pageantry. They don't really move the needle. They don't really persuade anybody. So Trump did his thing. Democrats did their thing. I just don't, for the amount of attention it gets, it's a little silly. I do think Democrats have to figure out something different though. Holding up,
they do, and nobody's figured out how to handle this Trump thing. I think if you get down in the mud with them, you're going to lose, but you got to respond in some way. I don't know. But I don't think any views were changed last night. And I look forward, we're having a conversation on Friday with Mark Watney from Farmers Union to talk about tariffs. These tariffs are going to be a big deal for North Dakota. And I think it's something that we need to spend more time thinking about and talking about.
I wrote a column. We'll close out talking about this. The column probably will be published, I think, by the time people are listening about this, because I just filed it before the show. But I was kind of riffing on what I thought was a very interesting statement sent out by North Dakota Farm Bureau President Darrell Lees, who, if you know Darrell Lees, and you probably don't, but apparently he's a talk radio host, in addition to being the president of the Farm Bureau. But he's a very pro-Trump, pro-MAGA guy. And his statement, I'm reading this and I'm just laughing to myself because it's like he's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
You want some dancing?
There is no question that Donald Trump's tariffs are going to hurt farmers and ranchers. In fact, the National Farm Bureau president put out a statement saying, by the way, his name's Zippy Duvall. That's really his name.
Zippy
Duvall. How great is that? I wish I had a great nickname like that. Nobody's calling me Zippy though.
I'm going to start calling you Zippy. Here we go.
All right. He was basically talking about, for instance, we get most of our potash, which is a very important ingredient for fertilizer, from Canada. So what is that going to do to fertilizer prices? And then downstream from that, what is that going to do to food prices in the United States? Darrell Lees' comment, he goes, North Dakota Farm Bureau recognizes the importance of both national security and fair trade. President Trump's recent tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China are part of a broader effort to ensure that American industries, including agriculture, compete on a level playing field while strengthening our nation's security. This is where it gets interesting. We understand that these actions may bring short-term hardships to farmers and ranchers. Agriculture has always been a cornerstone of our state's economy, and we remain hopeful that negotiations will lead to a swift and fair resolution that uphold the long-term interests of our producers and country. And I'm thinking to myself, that is an acknowledgement that this is going to hurt.
Yep.
This is going to hurt, and they're trying to get out ahead of it. And it's just remarkable to watch. It really is. So that is going to be, because so much of Trump's base is rural America, and it's going to be interesting. The first time he did this, when he did it on China, which, by the way, these are going to hurt a lot more than what he did with China, because we have a lot of trade with Canada and Mexico. We have a lot with China too, don't get me wrong. But I mean, directly in terms of agriculture and that, Canada's our number for North Dakota. Canada is like number one by a country mile in terms of a source for North Dakota exports.
I also saw that these tariffs on Mexico and Canada are going to drive up the cost of cars. For a small car, $6,000, and a SUV by $9,000. What's that going to mean for automobile dealers in this state? And like, there's so many things that are affected by that. With that, all that being said, Trump is supposed to be meeting with Trudeau this morning. So who knows with Trump, he might be, I think that in the Commerce Secretary, somebody said they might already be backing away from these things. I mean, this is, and like we talked about Dakota, this is quite a way to do foreign policy where from day to day, Trump is just, not knowing what he wants to do, if it's war, if it's tariffs, if it's whatever. But
what they'll do is Trump will flip-flop. Yeah. Right. And by the way, I don't mind people changing their minds. I wish he would.
On the daily.
I wish he would think a little bit longer before he opened his mouth in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, if he changes his mind, great. I mean, please back away from this. But then what'll happen is all the Trump supporters will be like, see, it was just a tactic. It was just a tactic. It was just
a brilliant guy.
What a brilliant guy. He said a dumb thing, and then he had to back away from it. But it was all strategies, playing 4D chess, and the rest of us can't follow it. Or maybe he's just a bad leader. I don't know. But anyway, I thought that was
Rob, you do know.
I do know. Yeah. I do know. He's a bad leader. All right. Anyway, I thought that was very interesting. The statement from the North Dakota Farm Bureau, because they are dancing, and if the pain continues, there may come a point where there has to be some changes because one of the immutable realities is if Americans start to feel pain, actual pain, they will change their mind. We were talking about that in the context of vaccines, just to bring us full circle. If Americans start dying in number from measles, you're going to see support for vaccines go back through the roof. If Americans continue to see grocery store prices go through the roof and farmers are getting put out of business because of the price of fertilizer and everything else, you're going to see some changes. So It's going to be interesting to watch. All right, we're going to stop there. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Hey, Friday, we have a really informative show. We're talking K through 12 education with Dr. Kopis and tariffs with Mark Watney.
Yeah,
we'll be informed by it, Rob.
We will be informed by it. Dr. Amy Kopis, and then also Mark Watney from the Farmers Union. I think it's kind of funny that in agriculture we have like the Republican Party, the Farm Bureau, and the Democratic Party, the Farmers Union.
Farmers Union's not going to like that. They're nonpartisan, Rob.
I know, I understand, but also, the realities are what they are. I'm not the one who came up with that. It just
no, you're certainly not. But
I doubt that Daryl Lees would come on the podcast, but I would have liked to have him on and put some questions to him about what do you mean about this pain? Like,
maybe we can have him on Wednesday and he can respond to what Watney has to say.
Maybe you could just come out and admit that the tariffs are a bad idea and you're really, really hoping he changes his mind. Maybe you could just say that.
Well, and I think the members of Farm Bureau, if they start feeling the pain, I hope they hold him to account.
Maybe time for regime change at the Farm Bureau. All right, we're going to go. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Leave us a voicemail or send us a text message at 701-587-3141. That's 701-587-3141. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host, Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening. Well, yeah, he's a doctor and he's saying this stuff, but this super hot yoga instructor on Instagram is telling me I could stop measles with essential oils.